Shabbat Shalom. I don't know how many of you remember Wayne Rimmer. That was Trish's stepdad. Trish Dorland, I think was her name when she was here. But he passed away on July 5th. And I just found out about it this morning. He was probably the first person from the Missouri area that stopped in here. I think he's the first one that picked up a Levitical writings and took it back to Independence. So a lot of you may not remember him. I have to reach back there pretty far. But you might remember Trish. Joy still keeps in touch with Trish. But I thought I'd just let you know. Julie had just let me know this morning. We're going to continue to talk about what we did last week. And you remember this. We're talking about the stories that we develop, that we pass on from generation to generation, and how they shape our thinking and shape our worldview. And I mentioned that a lot of people who come into the Messianic movement and see that what God said in His Word still stands, and come into the Hebrew roots, Messianic, whatever you want to call it, have really gone through a tremendous rage at the church, saying the church lied to them, and paganism and all the rest. And I showed you a few things last week that indicate the early church was not pagan, but what it was, I'm going to talk about today. The early church was anti-Semitic. And we're so unaware of it, it's part of who we are, and it really impacts our walk today, because there are a lot of people who pick up the Bible and say they believe the Bible and they hate Jews. They're not even aware they do, but we'll just look at some things. The origin of most Christian unbiblical practice. We don't have to invent or speculate to discover the true source of the problem. It is the hatred of Jews and Judaism. And I'll take one for example. What day do most Christians worship? Sunday. Where's that in the Bible? It just isn't. Now, I'm not mad at anybody, but how did we go from this is an eternal covenant that I've made with my people as a sign, the Sabbath, to God changed it, or what they say now is that God doesn't care. And I'm going to point out that a lot of what's happened to the church, and God's in control. I don't even like God's in control, but God is sovereign. The problem I have with saying God is in control, and most of that's true, is that God has given you a huge amount of control. He lets you determine what happens in your life. Okay, the hatred of Jews and Judaism. This is not something we have to speculate. This isn't something we have to go, I wonder if this is true. Would you have the next one, Sharon? A lot of people will learn that Constantine is the one who changed the day from Sabbath to Sunday and who eliminated the feasts. What happened? Constantine became the emperor in the early 300s, 4th century, and he had a conversion experience. A lot of people say it wasn't genuine. Some say it was. You know what? We don't know. It's a pretty powerful experience if you've never read it. In any case, Constantine decided that the empire was going to be Christian, the Roman Empire. And so he got the bishops together who at this point had the power in the church. Bishops in different places. The Bishop of Rome, Bishop of Constantinople, a lot of different bishops. And he said, let's get this sorted out. We're fighting over doctrine to the point we don't know what we believe. He's a general. He's an emperor. He says, you guys come up with something. And one of the things they did was they solemnized Sunday instead of Sabbath. Because, and I'll show you why, they felt that anything Jewish was tainted. Now this is something he did say. It appeared an unworthy thing that in the celebration of this most holy feast, and he's speaking of Passover or Easter, we should follow the practice of the Jews who have impiously, however you want to say that, defiled their hands with enormous sin and are therefore deservedly afflicted with blindness of soul. Let us then have nothing in common with the detestable Jewish crowd, for we have received from our Lord a different way. So already, this is less than 300 years after the crucifixion, the church is saying, we're not going down the Jewish path. And that's when they began to change dates and change practice. Next. This is another statement of his. Let us then have nothing in common with the Jews who are our adversaries. Let us studiously avoid all contact with that evil way. Is that a biblical concept? Is this what Paul said? How could something like this become so much? It's actually in the roots of who we are in the church. That if it's Jewish, it's bad. How many of you, when you kept a feast, had someone say, why are you trying to become a Jew? I still remember what Chris shared when he was working for the State Road, and we were celebrating Sukkot, and he told, I think it was Von Rowley, whoever he was working with, that Eskel's getting ready to celebrate Sukkot. And Von said, well, why are you doing all that Jewish stuff? Don't they know that Jesus was a Christian? I'm not making that up. Next. John Chrysostom was one of the early church fathers, and if you can believe, I've forgotten what city he was the bishop of. Corinth? No, I don't think so. Anyway, if you studied his life, he was a saint in so many ways. He was a wonderful man. He loved Yeshua, but he was terrified because he saw the early believers, they would join with Jews and celebrate the Sabbath. And then they would celebrate the feast, and it was such a beautiful thing. And then they'd go to the Bible and find out these are eternal covenants. And so he said, we've got to stop this. It's going to destroy Christianity. What is this disease? The festivals of the pitiful and miserable Jews are soon to march upon us, one after the other, and in quick succession. The Feast of Trumpets, the Feast of Tabernacles, the fasts. There are many in our ranks who say they think as we do. Yet some of these are going to watch the festivals, and others will join the Jews in keeping their feasts and observing their fasts. I wish to drive this perverse custom from the church right now. Are these feasts of the Jews? Anybody here ever read Exodus 23 or Leviticus 23? And the reason I'm pointing this out to you is not to be angry with Christians. The reason I'm pointing it out to you is this is who we are. This is where we come from. And so that we focus our canon on the paganism of the church, which crept in because of this. But the problem is that we were hating the Jews. Christianity is the child of Judaism. So when we hate Judaism, we hate our Father. There's a commandment about that. Did you have a comment, Jared?
No, agreed.
And I think this is amazing because I'm giving you a snapshot of John Chrysostom. You're going to think he's a bad guy. He's not. Go study him. This man loved the Lord, but he felt that anything that was Jewish was evil. Next. Where have we seen this pattern before? And you already know. Jeroboam instituted his own priesthood, his own feast, and created new places of worship at Bethel and Dan. And he did none of that to be pagan. He did it to get away from the Jews and Jerusalem. These aberrations did not arise from a desire for paganism, but rather an impulse to avoid Judah and Jerusalem. Why didn't he want his people to go to Jerusalem? He was afraid they would return to a son of David. Why did Chrysostom not want the early Christians to keep the feasts? He was afraid they would return to Judaism. Next. Hatred of the family and debah. You remember debah is this word, this Hebrew word that means slander. Debah is this word that means spying on someone to see what's wrong with them, to pick out the vulnerable areas so you can destroy them and bring them down. It opened us up to paganism. Anti-Semitism in the church was built upon a foundation of anti-Semitism already flourishing among the pagan population. There's a story written by Apion, an Alexandrian rhetorician. How do you say that, Kenneth? I have no idea. Teresa, anybody know how to say? That was in the book. Anyway, there's a story that he wrote before the time of Yeshua. Have the next slide. I don't think I put the story in here, or did I? No, I didn't. So I'll tell you the story briefly. In this story, a Greek who was traveling the world was captured in Israel and taken to Jerusalem into this beautiful room, and then every day he was given the best food. He was given fruits and sweets and all the meat he wanted, and this went on, and he was getting to where he liked it, and then he thought, what's going on? And then he heard that what was happening is they were preparing him to be a sacrifice at Passover because the Jews need human blood for the celebration of Passover. Now, how many of you know that is the stupidest thing you've ever heard in your life? People believe it today. This is the foundation of the blood libel, and the church picked it up and went on with it, saying that Jews need the blood of a Christian to celebrate Passover. Now, if you know a thing about the Bible and Judaism, human blood is repulsive in the sanctuary, in food, anywhere. This is one of the problems some Christians have had, thinking Yeshua's blood was taken in the earthly sanctuary. Was not. Next. Okay, no, this is it. This is something I didn't realize. This would have been like 50 years after Constantine. In 388, a bishop spurred his congregation to burn the synagogue at Callinicus in Mesopotamia. Again, I have no idea how to say these words. The emperor Theodosius ordered the synagogue to be rebuilt by the bishop and the arsonist punished. In other words, Christians burned down a synagogue, and the emperor said, it's against the law. You can't do that. So the emperor ordered the arsonist punished and for that congregation to rebuild the synagogue. St. Ambrose intervened and wrote a letter to the emperor chastising him for favoring the synagogue. Was he favoring the synagogue? No, this was justice. It's just like somebody coming in here burning down this building, and then someone saying, those House of Aaron people are disgusting. I applaud that burning down of their building. The synagogue is a home of unbelief, a house of impiety, a receptacle of folly. Do you think there might be some prejudice here? Just thought you might be curious. Laws protecting the Jews were wrong and should be annulled and disobeyed. The emperor was faced with being refused the sacraments. So he retreated and became complicit in breaking the law of the land. That synagogue was not rebuilt, and the people that burned it down were heroes, not crooks. How many times did something like this happen? Hundreds, maybe thousands. Next. Here's just a few things. In 1840, the priest at Damascus, there are a lot of wonderful Catholic priests. I think you know that. This wasn't one of them. This was a guy that was working with the underground. He was smuggling. He was involved in all sorts of unsavory practices. And one of the people he had defrauded in a deal apparently murdered him. They couldn't find his body. So what they decided is the Jews had killed him. They found some bones in a drain and said they were his. And this is 1840. They took him to a doctor, and the doctor wasn't even sure they were human. In any case, a great group of Jews were tortured until they confessed, till they killed this guy. And finally, the Jews of the world rose up in protest. They went in there and they released the people that weren't dead yet. But this is a story that is told by those who believe in the international conspiracy of Jews, where Jews went in and changed history, because actually this guy was a saint, and he is now a saint in the Catholic Church, this priest. After the Holocaust, in the late 40s and early 50s, Emory University had a dental school, and they had a quota for the number of Jews they would allow to come to school. Over the years, it was shown that not one Jewish student ever finished school. They all had to keep repeating their classes or getting flunked out. Brickman, who flunked out and was a B-plus student, went home and his parents were furious with him for not studying and fiddling around while he should be going to school. But when the Jewish students made those molds of teeth like you have to in dental school, their professors would come up and destroy them. One time, a professor threw the mold out the window and called them slimy, dirty Jews. Years and years after, Brickman was able to show that the dean of the school was a thoroughgoing anti-Semite, and he did not want any of these guys to graduate. I bring this up because this was after the Holocaust. And something like this cannot happen unless overall we don't care. Try doing that to one of your kids. You'd say something, you'd do something, and people would stand up for you. They went back and researched this, and Emory University, which does not have a dental school now, formally apologized to these Jewish guys. And this is recently. There's a song, and it must be, what's that stuff I can't stand? Rap? But it has this line in it. We've been getting that Jewish money. Everything is kosher. Well, he retweeted this, and a bunch of people said, you know, that's kind of severely anti-Semitic. And he comes out with this, I didn't mean to hurt anybody. I thought this was a good thing to say. He never said he was sorry he did something wrong. It's so much a part of our thinking we don't realize what's going on. Next. In 1943, I may have told you about this. At that point, most of you know the war went from 41 to 45. So 43 would be right in the middle of it. The Jews had been undergoing persecution for much longer than that. But what was going on at Auschwitz and the different places was well known by now. And some rabbis marched on the White House. October 6, 1943. It's an interesting date. That's the date we came to the community in 1958. It's also Christie's birthday, I think. But on this date, 400 rabbis marched on the White House asking for help for Jews enduring the Shoah. That's what the Jews call the Holocaust. All they were asking is, could we bomb the railroads so they can't take the cattle cars in? Because this is how they were moving the Jews, were in these huge rail cars. And they just said, do anything to help the people. FDR refused to meet them and sneaked out the back door on the advice of his counselors. I bring this up because, can you imagine somebody getting away with that now? And yet if they were going to get away with it, it would be because it would be with two groups of people, Jews and Christians. Those two groups, it's okay to be prejudiced against them. Next. This is something I didn't know about. After the war, and we had liberated the concentration camps, the Jewish prisoners were put in compounds where they were treated as bad as they were during the Holocaust. They were not given adequate rations. If they tried to sneak out to get food, they were shot. One fellow that killed a Jew that was trying to go get some food said, oh, my gun accidentally discharged. He got nothing. No reprimand, no court-martial, nothing. That's an American soldier that did that. What changed it was a campaign by two privates, Hilliard and Herman, and you can tell from their name what nationality they were. They were Jews. And they were horrified at what was happening. So they sent home to the U.S. and said, raise funds so we can get food and clothes for these people who have been let go from concentration camps to be treated the same way. In some of these concentration camps, the Jewish prisoners were getting far better treatment than the released Jews. And our guys were fine with it. Some of them. What finally happened is this came to the attention of General Eisenhower and Harry Truman, and they did address the situation. Those are two men in my eyes who are heroes because they, whatever else they might be, they were not anti-Semitic. Next. How many pictures could I come up with like this? Thousands. People standing there that have literally starved off every ounce of fat they've got. People that are living on nothing. Most of these people died. But after the war, we found thousands of them like this. And it couldn't have happened if Christianity had any kind of healthy attitude toward Judaism. We did not. I'm not saying there weren't individuals. You know the Corrie ten Boom story. They gave their lives saving Jews. But were they the majority or a very, very small minority? And I'm banging on this because when we turn our guns on the paganism of the early church, which some came in, we miss what really went wrong, and that is we hated our family. The Jews are our family. I've told the story many times because I think it's sad but powerful that there were a group of German women who had married Jewish men. And they gathered these men up and put them in prison, and were going to send them off to the concentration camp. The wives went to, would it be Berlin? I don't know if Berlin was the capital. What was the capital of Germany during, was Berlin? Okay, so that's where they went. They just staged a mass sit-in and said, we're not leaving until our husbands are released. Well, the news media carried this story. Everybody, they released every one of those guys. Not one of them went to the concentration camp because 50 women stood up for them. Who stood up for the Holocaust people? I know of a young Mormon that did. He was beheaded. Dietrich Bonhoeffer, executed. The 10 Booms. Corey's the only one that came out alive. I don't think we have any concept that if society stands up as a voice, you can stop this kind of thing. But when it happens and no one says anything, it's an indication of a rottenness inside. Next. The Holocaust is a testimony against the church. I don't know how many times I heard that the Holocaust happened because Jews didn't receive Jesus. That's not the story at all. The Holocaust happened because we didn't. We were the problem. We said we believed in Yeshua, but can anybody here say that a Jew is not the brother of Yeshua? Matthew 25. Inasmuch as you've done it to the least of these my brothers, you've done it to me. The church is in a horrible position because of the Holocaust, because we stood and watched it happen institutionally. In Europe, in America, in South America, over the face of the world, we did not stand up and speak against it. Individuals did, and thank God for them. While millions of our brothers and sisters died, we kept silent. Next. The debauch against Jews was the terrible part of this evil. In other words, the slander against Judaism, that's why I quoted Constantine and Chrysostom. And I've got a lot of friends on Facebook that still repeat this stuff and they don't even know where it comes from. It's just part of their nature. There's a constant rehearsal of the responsibility of Jews for the death of the Messiah. Mark Barbuti, Andrea's husband, he told me that in Italian, one of the names for Jews is Christ killer. That's what they're called, the Christ killers. It becomes part of the culture. According to Scripture, who killed the Messiah? Who's responsible for it? Is there one of us sitting here that is not responsible for it? Not if I know how to read it. Whose sins did he bear? I mean, it's amazing how we altered theology to fit the perspective. And then the failure to know our brothers. Belief in the blood libel requires the total ignorance of Jewish worship. Human blood and food or sacrifice is a total abomination. This story is still being repeated. I just read it in a Palestinian paper within the last month. That Jews are gathering Palestinian children and sacrificing them so they can have human blood for Passover. And what's more, when people quote the story, they can quote somebody that's witnessed it so they know it's true. Repetition and rehearsal of false stories, debauch, led to generations of Christians who saw Jews as subhuman. Anybody that studied the Holocaust, you'll know that what the Germans called the Jews were Untermenschen. It just means subhuman. If you don't think there are parallels, how do we describe fetuses today? Are they people? They're Untermenschen. What were the Native Americans? Untermenschen. What were the blacks? Go read the debates between Lincoln and Douglas, and it will fry you to see that everybody believed that blacks were subhuman. Next. Over time, it becomes impossible to let go of the evil slander, whether or not it is true, partly true, or completely false. It becomes part of our culture and narrative. Debauch flourishes in ignorance and the refusal to learn. And we've got some time to take some stories, to tell you some stories. I'll just ask you, how many of you here know a Jew? We know one or two, right? You'd be surprised at the number of people that believe in all this stuff against Jews that don't know one. Ignorance and refusal to learn. Next, Sharon. What can we do? You all know the story of slander and letting the feathers go on the Mount of Olives. It's much easier to let them go than to recapture them. And I'll go through this quickly, but you know the story. I heard it in the Derek and Lydia Prince. And she, I think, had heard it before, but while they were living in Jerusalem, Derek and Lydia Prince, someone spread a story about Lydia Prince that was absolutely false. It was pure slander. Well, the way good stories, you know how it is. I was told never to say anything good, and I've never told never to tell anybody anything unless it's good, and boy is this good. This story circulated around until it had vilified and shamed Lydia through their whole fellowships in Israel. Well, this guy finally felt contrite because he knew it was false, and he came to Lydia and asked for forgiveness, which she readily gave. And he said, "What else can I do?" And she said, "I just have one thing I'd like you to do." And she gave him an old down pillow and said, "Go up on the Mount of Olives, rip it open, and dump out the feathers." He thought, "Whew, that's easy." So he did that. Then he came back to her, and she said, "Now would you take that pillowcase and go get the feathers back?" And he looked at her like, "Well, of course, I can't do that." And she said, "Well, good luck with the slander." It's hard. What do you do? And it's just like I'm talking about some of this anti-Semitism, and you're already prepared to know what I'm saying is true, at least mostly. A lot of people can't even receive it, or they don't even know this is how they think. We haven't come to peace with the idea that people say they know Yeshua. They say they're Christians, and they think this way about Jews, blacks, Native Americans. I don't care who it is. Next. Our debauch against our Christian brothers and Jewish brothers continues to divide us and keep us out of the inheritance. And if you remember that when Joseph spoke this debauch slander against his brothers, it kept Israel out of the land for 400 years. When the spies spoke it against the land, it kept them out of the inheritance for 40 years. My point is, we're coming to a day when God's bringing Judah and Ephraim together, and we're coming into our inheritance. We need to redeem this. Next. A crucial piece to the puzzle is finding out our identity. I don't know about the rest of you, but when I got older, I suddenly realized how smart the stories were that I learned growing up. Like, do all of you know the story of the emperor who had no clothes? How about the ugly duckling? The ugly duckling, if you'll go back and read the unabridged story the way that Hans Christian Andersen wrote it, it will blow your mind. Because it's a story about what we're talking about. Why was the ugly duckling so unhappy? He wasn't a duckling. And what's really amazing in the story, when does he first find out he's a swan? The reflection in the water. What is the water? It's the Word. He looks and he sees who he really is. And when he does that, he's a beautiful, powerful swan, not an ugly duckling. People today need to know who they are. Would you agree with me that our society right now is going through tremendous strain and shaking because people don't know who they are? Do you know how many psychological conditions have to do with, I don't know who I am? There's nothing simpler than gender biologically. XX, XY. How are we doing on one that's simple? It's driving us apart. Kids are losing their minds over it. We have 5- and 6-year-olds that are on hormone treatments, and early prepubescent females having mastectomies. I think we have an identity problem. We don't know who we are. And if you go back to Levitical Writings 3:01, when Bishop was caught up and he looked down, you know what he saw? People just wandering, just crying out because they didn't know who they were. They were confused. I do not have any idea how to say this name, but we'll try Szigeti. He helped found Jobbik, which was an ultra-right nationalist party in Hungary. Because he went up through the ranks so fast, his enemies investigated his family, and they discovered the best thing they could. His maternal grandparents were Jewish, and so was his mother. Now, Jobbik is based on the ideals of supranationalism, anti-Semitism, and neo-Nazism. He found out that most of his family had been killed in the Holocaust, so his grandparents and his mother had worked extremely hard to conceal their identity, and he didn't even know he was Jewish. Next. I've told you Jobbik built its identity on this Hungarian identity, and part of their belief is that Jews are part of a cabal of Western economic interests attempting to control the world. This comes out of the protocols of the elders of Zion. When I was a little boy here in the community, people in the community read this. It is a hoax. It's false. There's nothing in it that's true. And yet I have people on Facebook quote me this kind of stuff, that Jews control the economy. How do Jews do that? I mean, have you ever thought about this? If someone said, Americans control the economy, they'd look at you like, well, yeah, I guess some do. You cannot ever lump an ethnic group and say they all do something. Jews are right, they're left. They're up, they're down. They're smart, they're dumb. They're people. They're not a national cabal controlling the world. Basically, this was a neo-Nazi, anti-Semitic group, and it once petitioned the government for a list of all the Jews in the Hungarian government because they wanted to publish that in Hungary to destroy these people's lives. Now this guy finds out he is one. Next. Being Jewish ended his Jobbik career, even though he founded the party. When he first, just get this, when he first admitted the truth of his Jewish ancestry, one of his friends in the Jobbik party said, the best thing would be if we shoot you so you can be buried as a pure Hungarian. What? This isn't 50 years ago, 100 years ago. This is in the 2000s. This is how people are wired. Another urged him to make a public apology. For what? If someone came to you and, actually this has happened. I was going to say, if someone asked you to apologize for being a Conrad, then I suddenly realized, I remember I had family up in the great Northwest and I had people pray over them trying to cast out the spirit of Conrad. It didn't work, you know. Apology. It was this comment, he says, that made him leave the party. I thought, wait a minute. I'm supposed to apologize for the fact that my family was killed at Auschwitz. I'm taking some time to expose this. Next. He embraced his true identity, in spite of the fact he didn't know a single Jew. Here's this guy that built a career on anti-Semitism. He didn't know a single Jew, but he combed one's hair every morning. How many people out there do you think are Israel? And they're fighting it, they don't believe in it, they don't want any part of it, And yet the Holy Spirit's going to stand and say, you are Israel. You're part of the commonwealth of Israel. You may have been far away. You've been brought near through the blood of Messiah. Teresa.
Just a comment. Remember when it all came out of Madeleine Albright, Secretary of State?
Oh, yeah.
Her family was Jewish. She never knew.
No, that's right. She didn't know.
She didn't know. When they asked her, she goes, no. And they were religious. But no.
No, see, they were in a good Christian family, but again, her family was very similar to his in that they said, we're going to erase our Jewish identity because they had escaped the Holocaust also. So he contacted a local rabbi to learn the essentials of Judaism. And I love this comment. I quoted this. This is what he thought. I cannot be Jewish. I don't have a big enough nose, a hunchback, and 2 bags of money under my arms. That's funny, but it's awful, isn't it? When you think of a Jew in literature, what do you think of? Who are your types? Shylock. And I forgot. Who's the guy in Ivanhoe? Anyway, our Jewish types in literature perpetuate this stupidity. Were there Jews that were good with money and pretty greedy? Of course there were. By the way, there are non-Jews that are too. He formerly converted to Judaism, was circumcised, and took the Hebrew name of David. Now he travels the country giving seminars and lectures exposing the evils of anti-Semitism and the hatred of any group of people. This is the thing that really came clear to him as he embraced his Jewish roots. He said, why are we hating other people groups? Why? What's the hatred? And it's an amazing story of redemption, but it's all about identity. He found out who he was. This is an amazing story if you think of if you look at 301 and that Bishop was told to build a house for all the tribes, this comes down to telling people who they are. We try to make people feel guilty about not keeping the Sabbath. It's never going to work. They need to know they're Israel. They need to know that perpetual covenant God made with the Sabbath is with them. We don't eat the unclean and we eat the clean, not because we're better, but because we're Israel. Next. The power of the bad report can only be blunted by the truth. What makes someone anti-Semitic, he ponders, voicing the eternal question. I had never met a Jewish person in my life, and I found that just amazing, that you have this whole system that's built upon a people you hate, and you have never met one of them. Indeed, how did he pick up on these ideas? Szigeti attributes this to having grown up amongst young people who are very nationalistic. In addition, anti-Semitic literature became available in the 1990s, and I did a lot of reading. He says, fingering the explosion of the internet, you must be careful what young people access, he warns. How many of you know that what's out there on the internet is causing a lot of bad stuff? This fellow that went into the black church, they welcomed him, they were having a prayer meeting, they invited him to sit down with them, and he stood up and shot everybody sitting around the table in the prayer circle. He had spent the last 10, 15 years rehearsing that, get this, that the blacks are destroying our country. Really? This rehearsal will do it. Next. And then this is the power of forgiveness and service. And I just put the story up here. You might know this. You know the community of Bethel, several of us have been there. Sharon and Cindy went there. Kaya and Tara went there. They first came to Israel in 1963 with 3 people and a prophetic call to the land and the people of this new country. They were praying in Germany, and the Lord told them they were to go to Israel. How many of you know that German Christians aren't the most loved group in Israel? Especially in 1963. This group is. They were allowed to purchase some property, but for the most part, they were not welcomed. The first few years saw some quiet and some overt hostility to their presence in the young country of Israel, and especially in the area of Zikron Yaakov, which just means remembering Jacob. Haystacks were burnt, irrigation lines were cut, and they knew they were not wanted. They never retaliated and only went to their knees and prayed for those who were making life difficult for them on a regular basis. That was like when we first came here, we had some people in the valley that didn't want us to be here. It never got to this level. But there were definitely people that didn't want us here. Next. As the community grew, more members, the Jewish religious community began to send religious Jews to live in Zikron Yaakov to balance out these new and strange Christians. In other words, they were terrified. We have a little town in Israel that's becoming Christian. Zikron was not originally a religious Jewish community. Mostly the farmers believed in Hashem and God. The other point is that Bethel never became involved in any form of overt evangelism. They were there only to be a blessing. And I repeat this today. When a Jew sees a Christian trying to convert them, the Holocaust, the blood libel, everything comes crashing down. Not the right way to approach it. For them, Jesus is the answer to someone else, not to them. The Jewish religious leadership, some say as far away as Jerusalem, inspired the young zealous men to drive Bethel out of the land. One night, many Israeli youngsters came to Zikron to disrupt and cause problems for Bethel. At the time, there were not very many people in Bethel, and they had just a few homes and some land. The youngsters created a riot by gathering outside the Bethel homes, began to throw rocks through the windows, and even some fire bombs. So this is taking persecution just another step further. Appropriately, the local police responded. The boys scattered, only a few were caught. They took the boys to the local police station and told Sister Emma, who was the founder of this, and the elders that they must come to the police station and press charges. They did not want to go to the police station, but the local authorities told them it was mandatory to come. When they arrived at the police station, they were faced with the boys and their parents. The police said that Bethel must press charges as the boys were responsible for these serious offenses. They knew the kids did it. They'd thrown the rocks, they'd broken the property, they'd thrown the firebombs. Next. That's not quite as bad as those homes would have looked. Next. These charges were serious enough to follow the boys through the rest of their lives. They would be restricted in their leadership positions. The army, public service would all be denied to them. Sister Emma and the elders refused to sign the formal charges. They said they understood why the boys did what they did, and they forgave them, and they did not want this situation to follow them through their lives. Now, I don't know about you, but when you start acting like Yeshua, that's more powerful than telling people what they should think. After this, the harassment ended for the most part, and many years went past, and Bethel grew in numbers. There are over 1,000 now. They also developed many of the ways that the Father showed them how they could bless the Jewish people. One of these was they built factories and hired Jews to work in the factories, and they do not produce things that compete with Israeli business. They produce things that are not being produced elsewhere in Israel. They felt the Lord gave them favor with the Jewish community and many ideas as how to create new jobs. The community prospered. Many new jobs for the Jewish people were created. They employ hundreds of Jews. They also began to start many other operations in different areas of Israel. There came a time when they felt, and I tried to change that. If you want to know something that drives me nuts, it's spelling lead. But there it is. I will fix it. That is not the right way. There came a time when they felt, thank you, Sharon, to start a work in Samaria. When they tried to find a spot for their next project, they were met with much opposition, and were not allowed to get a building permit anywhere they tried. So they were trying to get a building permit, and it was being denied, and there was a lot of opposition. This Christian group trying to build a factory in Samaria. Eventually, their attempts ended up before one of the highest officials in the northern part of Samaria. It resulted in a legal hearing before this official, and the end result was the official ruled in favor of Bethel's proposal to build a factory in the northwest corner of Samaria. After the hearing, the official spoke personally to the representatives of Bethel. He told them that he was, in fact, one of the boys that was forgiven and not charged all those many years ago. Furthermore, he stated that had he been charged, he would have never been allowed to hold this position. I find this an amazing story on so many levels, but it shows us that the way to get rid of the bad report, one of them, is education and then forgiveness. Walking in redemption, not in destruction. Next. That's the last one? Okay. There are a couple of things that I'll add to this as we bring this to a conclusion. I told you the stories of Joseph speaking the bad report about his brothers, and that what this brought, mixed in with his dreams about being over his brothers. I always love Joseph's dreams because those are some of the few dreams I can interpret easily. I saw my sheep out in the field and 11 sheep around me bowing down to me. I figured that one out. Then I saw the moon and the sun and 11 stars bowing down to me. I figured that one out too. Guess what his brothers did? Not a good thing. But combined with what his slander against them and his father's favoritism, the robe of many colors, we know that it brought this toxic atmosphere, this culture of hatred. What we don't understand is that culture of hatred is still in our civilization today, and we allow political leaders to move us there too. I frequently recommend to you, don't read, watch, pay attention to political statements that teach you to hate the other side. Because hatred only breeds violence. It breeds destruction. It builds nothing. The 12 spies who came back, well, actually, technically, there were 10 spies who came back and 2 that were not spies. We notice in the story of Joseph that Joseph gave the bad report and Judah marshaled his leadership to do a very bad thing, sell his brother into slavery. In the story of the spies, who is the son of Judah? It's Caleb. Who is the son of Joseph? It's Joshua. What's interesting in this story is that Caleb uses his leadership to say, we can go up and take the land. God has prepared this so we can take the land. And Joshua brings a good report. He says it's a good land. It flows with milk and honey. It's everything God said. In the story, even though this part doesn't end well, we see that both Judah and Ephraim redeem their past bad behavior. We see that there is a leadership component and a report component that is redeemed, that it's changed. And I think this is something that I would like us to think about, because in the house of Levi and Aaron, we know that our call is to unify. In fact, again, if you go back to that writing, build a house for all the tribes, that's a very amazing statement, because everybody so far has built a house for the people who agree with them. Are you aware that God's asking you to build a house for the people who don't agree with you? And it's about identity. Whose family are they? Where do they belong? And I think this is very significant, because I think everybody here would admit they've got brothers and sisters, aunts, uncles, children, nieces, nephews who don't agree with you. But they're still family. And if they needed you, you'd be there at the drop of a hat. Judah and Ephraim only come together. If you go back to that passage in Isaiah 11 that we start with, verse 12, Isaiah 11, he will raise a banner for the nations and gather the exiles of Israel. He will assemble the scattered people of Judah from the four quarters of the earth. Ephraim's jealousy will vanish. Judah's enemies will be cut off. Ephraim will not be jealous of Judah, nor Judah hostile toward Ephraim. Would you say that that's come to pass yet? No. Ephraim is still... Why is Ephraim jealous of Judah? Because Judah has no qualms about they're the people of God. In fact, this is one of the things underneath what we call... I'm going to forget the word. What do we call the theology that the church has replaced Replacement theology, that'll work. We teach people that God's done with the Jews and now his Israel is the church. That clearly identifies us as jealous. Is Judah hostile to us? I think I've shared this with you before, but I was on Facebook or some chat line, and there were some Jewish people sharing some things there, and they were talking about how the church, Christians, represent Edom. They're Esau. They're the carnal, bad part of the family. And I was fuming because I thought that was pretty mean. And so I leave my house to run, and I go out to the trees and run, and I just starting, and I was still thinking about this early in the morning. And suddenly the Holy Spirit just stopped me in my tracks. And it says, John, do you know that to most Jews you're not Edom? Well, I said, of course I'm not. He said, to most Jews, you're Amalek. And that just was like a sword in my heart. Do you know what the Bible says about Amalek? It says to blot out the memory of Amalek from under heaven. What was Saul told to do with the Amalekites? What did he get in trouble for? Saved the king, and he brought back the best of the animals. You know, as a child reading the King James Version, I remember that was Samuel happy about what Saul did with the Amalekites? He was pretty unhappy. In fact, he was angry. He said, what is this bleating of sheep that I hear? This lowing of cattle. He said, what's going on? You're supposed to have destroyed it. And Paul went on to say, the people wanted to save some of these for sacrifice. And then he found out that he had saved the king, Agag. So Samuel tells Saul, bring me Agag, the king of the Amalekites. And in this Bible it says, Agag was feeling relieved, thinking that the worst is over. And the King James says, and Samuel hewed Agag to pieces before the Lord at Gilgal. I'm like, I can remember as a child, oh! I don't know about you, the picture I have of somebody taking a sword and cutting him, it was not a good picture. All that to remind you that literally when most Jews think of Christians, they think of Amalek. They think of a power that's out to destroy them, a power that tries to take away their identity, a power that doesn't want them to believe in who they are, and what's more, a power that's willing to kill them. How do you change that? How do you redeem that? We've had a couple of examples. It's through service. It's through forgiveness. And I don't think, when I was in Israel last time, Joy and I, we went with a tour group on the last day, and we came to this moshav, which is kind of like a kibbutz, but a little less formally organized, that had been built up during right after the Second World War, before the War for Independence. The British had made a law against any Jew making ammunition. Any Jew caught making ammunition would be executed. So they built this huge underground factory where they loaded bullets, built bullets, fired them and tested them, all underground, and they covered it with this supposedly agricultural community where they had geese, I don't know about geese, chickens and cows and goats, and so every time that the British would come and check, everything was fine, but if you went into the laundry room, they had a washer, what's that old washer we have that rolls? What do you call that thing? What's the washer we had over there that we used to use all the time? What's that? The great. Yeah, there was anyway, they had a washer just like that. It was on a pivot. And so there was a button you'd push, it would swing out of the way, and there were stairs down into this. It was they literally made all the ammunition that was used in the War for Independence, which of course wasn't their war. They accepted the UN mandate, the Arabs didn't, and attacked them. But anyway, we were down there, and it was 3 o'clock in the afternoon. It was time to say the Shema. And this whole group, every day, 9 and 3, they'd say the Shema. So we all turned to the east, Shema Yisrael, Adonai Eloheinu, Adonai Echad, Baruch Shem Kavod, Malchuto Leolam Vayed. And while we were doing this, there was a Jewish man over there, and he was openly dismissive of what we were doing and talking to somebody and just, And our tour guide, Mike Clayton, was angry because here we were trying to be good and kind and upbuilding, and he says, I forgot just what he said, but it wasn't complimentary. And it was later on that the Holy Spirit started to speak into my heart and say, do you realize that you've done nothing for that man to believe that you have his best interests at heart yet? And instead of being angry with him, use this to remind you that you want, when the Jews see you, you want them to see Yeshua. You want to see someone who loves them as a brother, someone who will die for them, someone who will forgive them, because you've got 2,000 years of history of hating, violence, hurting. And it was just it may have just been totally an experience for me. But as we bring this to a close, ask yourself not only these big general questions where we've said the bad report about Jews and frankly other people too, how do we redeem that? But in our own lives, what have we said about other people, other families? What cultures have we produced that allow a toxic environment to develop? One that actually allows hurt, evil speech, and even sometimes grows into violence. It's really something that causes you to be thoughtful. And then you ask yourself, Greg was talking about today, he was quoting Luke 14, and I turned to it while he was talking about it. Yeshua says 3 things that just kind of make you... He says, if you want to be my disciple, you'll have to hate your family. Now, of course, in Hebrew, it doesn't mean you hate your family. It means you love God more than your family. It also says you'll have to take up your cross daily and follow me. And then finally, you'll have to forsake all that you have and follow me. We're at this point in history where to walk on with the Lord, it's time to give up some of the stuff we've hung so tightly to. Some of it's not actually money. Some of it's old ideas. Some of it's judgments. There are any number of things. To go forward and be builders, we need to remember that statement in that Levitical Writings 3:01. Show not the evils of your brethren. And I think that's really where we are today. Thank you. Let's all stand. Ron Crouch, would you close for us, please?
Father, thank you for this Sabbath day. Thank you for the privilege of being here with our family and our brothers and sisters. Study your word, and we thank you, Lord, for the revelation and for the instruction we've had this morning. I pray that we will hear to our hearts. We pray, Lord, that we remember these things as we go about our activities throughout the week. Future months and years. This will help us to guide our ways and following your way. That everything that we do will be according to your will. In Jesus' name.
Amen. Thank you. That cooler seems like it's having problems. Is it even putting out cool air? I say it doesn't feel cool right now to me.